Call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting. There's 3 items on the agenda that we'll follow because we can amend the agenda in this special meeting format. First on the agenda is an update from Trainer HL regarding the steering committee and any related discussion or actions. And we have Mr. Andrew Pitts here to lead that discussion.
Okay, I'll do that. Go ahead. So what I was going to walk through is we provided a memo of an update on some of the actions and activities that have gone over the last couple of months. And so I just really wanted to walk through that. Please stop me along the way if you have questions or comments. I'm going to try to kind of hit it at a higher level, but if we need to drill down on anything, feel free to go ahead and ask me questions. So go ahead, Kelly. So we've begun really with an existing conditions survey. Really what this did is we toured the buildings both with our office and then also with the steering committee. It gives us a baseline of what are we working with, how do we begin to frame some of the discussions, what is the ability to renovate the 2 spaces. We also began to look at the life safety issues, code, ADA, some of the deferred maintenance. We've had engineers in to begin to look at those systems. And then out of that, we also recommended and you approved a mold, lead, and hazardous material survey. They are in the process. I believe they've collected most of their field samples. The initial report back I've gotten is they've encountered some additional asbestos samples than they were anticipating, and he should have a more detailed understanding of that on Monday to me. And then they'll begin their testing inside their lab to then be able to identify what those are and then also provide recommendations for remediation. Go ahead, Kelly.
Yes, sir.
Excuse
me, is that different than what's in our email?
He just gave it
Oh,
to me,
okay.
so I don't know.
Well, I was trying to find it in our packet, that's why.
This is a new presentation.
This is a new presentation. No,
Okay.
I have not provided this. I will provide this to
great.
Kelly after that.
Great.
This is more of just the highlights of the memo that
Okay.
you've been provided. At the same time, we've been working with stakeholders and the departments to develop a working program. What we've begun to look at this program is it gives us the framework of the spaces that go within the building. So we use the program that was developed previously as a base to kind of begin our discussion points. But from there, really ask the questions with a lot of the departments of how you do your work, where the work needs to happen, how do you interact with the public, what adjacencies, what other departments do you need to be next to, how often do you interact with the public. That then gives us a framework of how large of a space it should be, how many spaces there should be, and where the spaces should be within the building. What we've come up with is about a 49,000 square foot program. That is about, the previous one was 47,000. We've had some discussions within the steering committee on where that number comes basis on everything fit in the building before. This program number is bigger than what the 19,000 some odd square feet of the 1916 City Hall is. What's the difference? And there's a couple different areas that I want to kind of highlight. So the way we've looked at this is not a snapshot of how you were doing business before, but really it's a way to look at how a more efficient way business should be accomplished within the facility. So we've talked about the number of meeting spaces we should have. We've talked about how the public interacts with it. We then overlaid additional customer service and security issues on top of that. We've thought about how this building moves towards the future, and so it's not of how you're working today, but really this building is going to be a 50 to 75-year solution for this community. And the biggest thing is it doesn't have growth built into it, as we're anticipating a lot more staff, but we're trying to provide flexibility in there. So as operations change, as departments change, how can you be able to move within that space to provide the most flexibility for the city going forward? The second biggest thing that we've looked at is some of the changes within the police department and kind of where they've come from, what they were living in before, to really what does it take to operate an efficient law enforcement department. Some of the biggest issues is to separate investigations and interview rooms separate from offices. So before they would bring somebody in, they'd be sitting within an office environment to have that interview. It's now creating dedicated space, and so you're not bringing somebody from outside into a secure environment that could have sensitive information, be able to have that separate. We've also begun to look at how do we control evidence and being able to bring that in, properly log that, and then store that for the future going forward. And that condition to store evidence is continually growing within the state. The numbers and the years that they have to keep that seems to be continually to get longer. The other thing that we looked at is the fire and EMS department. One of the biggest parts of this program, about 15,000 square feet, is the apparatus bay. So one of the big differences from where you were in the 1916 building to where you are even today is today's the first time in many, many years that you have all of your equipment under one roof. And one of the positives of that is when you recently did your ISO certification, that actually that was one of the factors that they identified helped reduce the ISO rating. And so that's been a positive outcome. So as we go back into a new facility, wherever that may be, it would be our recommendation that you'd want to have all those apparatus again under a single roof. And the current 1916 building doesn't allow that with its current square footage. And also the size of those apparatus bays really doesn't fit the vehicles that you have going forward. I mean, I've heard stories of backing the ladder truck in there, and it's inches of clearance to be able to get that vehicle within the building. And then the other part of that on the fire and EMS is just the conditions for the living and the sleeping for the firefighters. There were some of the spaces that were in the 1916, as we go back into it, would not be code compliant, having windows within sleeping areas, having equity between the genders, and then just providing spaces that helps you with both recruitment and also retention of your department and your personnel. Lastly, the thing that we begin to look at is anytime we do a project, we have to bring the new project up to our current life safety building codes, ADA, and with that, there's some additional egress requirements that we'll have to factor in, and so there's some efficiencies of how the building worked before that will change as we move forward. Other things that we've considered is some of the trends that we see within municipal buildings, trends within the public safety buildings, and how those begin to impact the program. So I'll let Kelly kind of quick through these next couple, but what we've done is really develop, and this is again just a summary of those numbers. As you can see, we're about a 1,300 square foot difference from where that program was developed before. Go ahead, Kelly. And so for each space, and you can go through this quickly, each space we've developed a list of the program spaces and then also kind of a diagram of how those spaces begin to lay out. It allows us to then have a dialogue with the departments to understand when I say X amount of square feet, what does that really mean? How big of a space is that? How many people can meet within that room? And then where do those rooms want to be next to each other? And so we begin to understand those adjacencies. Any questions on the program before I go on?
Was staff involved in determining the program needs and
Yes, sir.
doing visioning for what they see the future involves as well?
Yes, sir. So we sat down with staff. I asked a lot of questions. We provided them also with a survey so I could begin to understand of how they're working and how they want to work. And then we walked through that, and I've then shown them this a few times to understand, is the right space? Have we captured everything? And we've then modified that along the way. We'll now take that and we begin to apply that, how that fits into those buildings. That will have some variations and some changes, and so we've shown them initially that. We need to come back and continue to develop that as we go forward. So as you can see, we've have about 48, just shy of 49,000 square feet. The 1916 square footage is just shy of 20,000. The temporary city hall is just over 61,000. So you see, we have to be able to balance how that square footage now fits in those two buildings, and that's one of the things we've been working through.
Was
You
one
made a
of-
statement a minute ago, 5 minutes ago. You said, we're looking over the next 50 years, the life
Correct.
of the building, and we expect that there will be a lot more staff over the years. Is that,
No, I did not say there'd be a lot more staff. We actually
I
don't
wrote it
have.
down as you said it.
Okay, we do not have staff growth built into it.
Okay, that's what
No,
I was
if I said
wondering
that,
about.
that was incorrect. We do not have staff growth built into
Okay.
it. We've accommodated the staff that is either currently budgeted or factored in with your departments.
Great, okay, thank you.
What we've looked at is more of how the building could change depending on how departments could change going forward.
Okay,
So no, we are not building staff growth into the program.
thank you, appreciate that.
You're welcome.
As you look at the square footage and the two options, just from the numbers, you can see the existing city hall isn't large enough to accommodate all the needs. So are you going to have an option of separating out some services to, like where we already got an apparatus bay, looking at options to include alternates
Yes, sir.
like that?
So what we have, and I'll show you kind of a list of it here in a moment, but we've come up with about 5 different scenarios that could be developed
Okay.
on where I'd say city administration functions go, and keeping public safety then together, and where do those then begin to fit within the city.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kelly. One of the things that we have had a discussion with the steering committee is understanding the land transfer, the demolition, and the lease agreements associated with the temporary city hall. As we began to discuss that specific building, there were a lot of questions that came up of how does that impact what can occur within that space, understanding of how we've kind of gotten to today, and making sure that we addressed any questions or concerns of the committee. We met with the mayor and then also with the city attorney to be able to understand those questions and talk through that. So the attorney kind of provided us an outline of some of the highlights that begin to restrict some of the operations within that. We talked about the pros and cons associated with that. We've also talked about within the demolition contract, Mercy's donation of $500,000 and how that potentially could be used. And it is the desire of the committee to kind of provide you recommendations on what that should or could be. And we're still working through that dialogue. And then also looked at the current and lease agreement and how does that impact the building today and going forward. This basically helped us give us a framework of how that temporary city hall building could be used moving forward and the options associated with that. Our office is also completing a historic structures report, and you can click through a couple of these slides, and this is just kind of some screenshots. So we've begun to look at kind of two different things associated with it. One of it is the significance of this space, and you can see that this floor plan begins to identify some of the more significant, and then also the architectural integrity. So those two things begin to then identify what spaces are more important to save and remain in a historic building, which are kind of in the middle ground, and then which are on the latter part that it really doesn't matter what we do with that. That then gives us a framework, as you see on that purple space, that's your main lobby space on the first floor. That's obviously one of the most significant and architectural integrity spaces in the building. So that's a primary space that we should preserve moving forward. The other space really is the exterior of the building and the character of the exterior. Other things from there begin to step down. You see the green is kind of the Class B, the blue is Class C, and the mustard is kind of the Class D, where it's really doesn't matter what we do with those spaces. Basically, the end result is there's really nothing that we've begun to look at that's going to limit us going forward. And so what we'll do is kind of work through it. As we also develop the concept within that building, we'll then be able to give you some ideas of if you went for tax credits, what does that mean? What are some of the limitations? And then what are some of the financial positives that go along with that?
So if you go for the tax credit, some of the renovations don't qualify.
Correct.
So you'll identify those
That's correct.
as what the potential return is, should that be a recommendation.
Sure. What we're going to do is we'll try to make some assumptions early on of kind of what are the qualifying expenses, then the portion thereof that you'd be able to get from a tax credit, the ability then to sell those on the open market and be able to use that money then to help fund the project. The other piece that we've worked on is we've reviewed the energy retrofit study that was completed by another firm. So our engineer came in, toured the temporary city hall, has looked at their recommendations, and has drafted an initial report and has continued to develop that report as we move forward. What those retrofits looked at was some phased recommendations on how to modify, add, or replace components within the building, and then how that would potentially impact the energy use. What we've determined is the things that they have outlined would not limit or restrict any use of that building going forward. So if you made these changes and per se you wanted this to be a hospital again, you could make these changes and it still revert back to a hospital. So you're not going to do anything with these changes that would limit you moving forward on either whether you're using the space or somebody else is using the space. They've estimated those costs to be about $400,000. From that, we believe that there's a potential savings up to 50% of the HVAC energy use. So if you think about the energy use, about half of that energy use is dedicated towards the HVAC equipment. So you'd be able to save half of that half is what would be going forward. So it roughly ends up being about an 8-year payback if you are paying those with your own funds. If we utilize the $500,000, obviously then that's even a more positive impact to the city going forward. Again, the steering committee is being looked through those recommendations and will provide you our feedback and our comments as we move forward. Go ahead, Kelly. So as mentioned, we've developed 5 different concepts that we've begun, and out of our last meeting, we'll have more that has come up in the dialogue, which is exactly what we want to hear. So we've looked at how do we fit departments within the 1916 City Hall building, and then building a new public safety building adjacent to, maybe it's on the public parking lot across the street or someplace. Another one would be is we renovate the 1916 City Hall building and we do an addition to your temporary apparatus bay to handle the public safety. Then do we do a phased renovation of the temporary City Hall? So we begin to look at how do we renovate the temporary City Hall, move departments in there where we're moving them once. So take like the lower level where the surgery bay was, take that, renovate that for one of the spaces, move them to that space, and then we go back and re-renovate that space. And so we're kind of shuffling the deck as we go along. That extends the period of time that construction is taking place, which also extends some of the costs. And so we're looking at what that impact is. We're also looking at kind of a medium ground. What if you just remodeled? We don't move as many walls. We don't try to touch as many spaces. But we come in and we upgrade the finishes and we make it more office environment as opposed to hospital environment. And the last piece that we provided to the steering committee is if you wanted to go out to a greenfield site somewhere, excluding how much it would cost to buy land is how much it would be just to build everything from the ground up, just to kind of give you some comparisons along the way. Go ahead.
So option C is to keep public safety in the hospital building.
Option C would keep public safety and all of the city departments within the hospital building. Yes, sir.
All city departments?
All the city departments.
Wait, let me see that again.
So option C.
No, I'm sorry. I was wondering about B.
B. So yes, that would keep on the green space to the south where the demolition occurred.
Right.
Would be to potentially have an addition there that attaches to the temporary apparatus bay.
It is a new public safety building.
It is a brand new public safety building.
Okay.
And then the question
So in
becomes,
option B, everybody's moving out of the hospital building, basically.
Option B, everybody. So you could still utilize the hospital building for some other use. Yes.
Okay.
What's it say on option D where it says remodel temporary City Hall?
What we've begun to look at is basically spending a lower cost per square foot to do that option, and it's more of finishes and some minor remodeling work. It's not a complete. In the option C, we're looking at taking everything down to the structure and the exterior walls and building it back to really function as the program sets fit. Option D looks at keeping the majority of the walls where they are and just changing the look and the feel into more of an office environment.
So your effective square footage
Doesn't change.
between C and D, C is a more efficient use of
Yes, sir.
space
Yes.
because you're going to affect corridor, room size, layout, so there'll be more building unassigned to City Hall, where D, where you're just cosmetically, you're going to keep a larger footprint in the building for city services, right?
Yes, I believe that's a fair statement.
Okay.
Yes. Go ahead. And these are some of the images that we've presented to the steering committee. And out of our discussions earlier this week, the committee came up with some additional ideas that we're going to continue to study and then bring that back to the committee for further development and discussion. Lastly, we had a discussion this week on kind of some of the other potential city projects that are out there. We have not come to any conclusions on what seems to make sense, but one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up today was just to put it in context of your discussion later this morning. We looked at, and this list was developed by us based from our discussions with department heads on what are some of the top things that you see coming out there. Some of the discussions we had at the steering committee is obviously some of the priorities that have risen up from the departments may not be a priority with over the city as we think about what are really the critical infrastructure needs versus well, it'd be really nice if we had a bunch of money, can do this type of a project. And so we haven't begun to rank or even begin to think about that. The discussion that we did have is how are these projects potentially funded? And one of the discussions that came out and kind of a consensus statement, and I'll go ahead and put it up, and I'll read this to you, is that Trainer HL and the steering committee are reviewing other potential projects within the city that could have a significant financial impact. Trainer HL and the steering committee would recommend that when outside funding sources are available, these should be used to fund the project. For example, when enterprise funds, grants, or low-interest loans are available, these should be used to fund the project. What our discussion really was is, as you think about some of the departments that have enterprise funds, is to the most extent possible and financially feasible, that those funds, those projects should be funded within those, and that then leaves the other resources that potentially go towards this project or other city projects that don't have those enterprise funds. That was really the kind of the consensus discussion that the committee had. Realizing that may not be possible, but at least we wanted to provide that kind of guidance and thoughts as you move forward within this discussion. Any questions or comments this time?
You know, a lot of people would like to keep City Hall downtown because it strengthens the downtown. And if you look at 100 small towns, 90 of them, their downtown is dying because of the internet and, you know, changes in how people shop and things. Is there any way to quantify the benefit to having the City Hall downtown in the original location, or is that just a, it might be nice kind of thing?
I'm not sure if there's numbers we could point to. I think, you know, we may be able to talk with the chamber from an economic development standpoint. Is there some, if the number of people that come to the downtown, is there ways that we can look at, is that generating other things?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the bigger things we look at is you speak about the courthouse and what that drives to a downtown environment.
Right.
Those numbers are typically higher from a city hall standpoint. So I think there's some there. Then there's the emotional side of it, which
Sure.
I think is probably the stronger thing. It's harder to quantify
Right.
that,
Yeah.
but that's probably the stronger thing that we see to come out of most of these discussions.
You haven't seen a study, though, that if we get this more, if we have this many more people coming downtown every day, the downtown benefits this much, or anything?
No,
Okay.
I think that what I see more is the emotional impact of when
Yeah.
you have
Sure.
when you have all the infrastructure there, it becomes more of a thriving downtown.
Okay. Thanks, Andy.
So when you're considering the other projects that you mentioned in your statement there, of course, we're all familiar with the water plant, some street sewers, all the big infrastructure projects. Is the committee headed toward looking at those projects, prioritizing them? Because it's all one big picture, because there's
It
only
is.
so much money.
Correct. Correct. Yes, ideally, yes. That's a hard discussion because that's very much opinion based on what you believe is a priority. The discussion we had was some of the items on that list are not a wish list, it's a critical feature.
Right.
And if these things don't occur, it could jeopardize other things.
Yep.
And so, but the majority of those things that are on that list that are that item or could potentially be funded outside of general obligation dollars. And so if you separate that, then it makes that list a little bit more manageable. And I think that then the committee can begin to look at that and say, of the remaining list, where do we see the priorities fit, and then kind of help that dialogue within the community. Now, we realize that you may not be able to do everything with enterprise dollars.
Okay, I got you.
But at least it kind of gives some framework of is to the most extent possible that would be obviously the direction the committee was discussing.
And one of the benefits I see from looking at it all as a, call it a master plan, is that even though the total amount might be more than what we should undertake in a general obligation bond or out of funds, it does still put it in a path that we can accomplish. It gives direction on the urgent needs that have to be done, the ones that can be done in 5 years, or it gives us a direction that we can look at as we retire loans, what is going to be next on the table, or as a grant becomes available, what, instead of searching, we'll have a direction and some plan of attack to go forward.
Correct.
What's your estimated completion date at this point?
Thank you. So one of the next steps is to continue to move forward the options that we've developed and the costs associated with it. The next step also with that is to begin a discussion of funding. And so we are going to look at bringing some resources in, whether that's your bond counsel or outside sources, to begin to have that dialogue of what are some funding opportunities, what are some of the things that we can begin to think about, what is some of the debt obligations that are currently under, and then what's available, and have that kind of dialogue, to have that kind of recommendation back to you. So barring anything unforeseen, I see us completing that portion of it within the next 30 to 45 days. And so I think one of the things that you should begin to think about is how to then begin to push this dialogue then out within the community as a whole. We've talked about these town hall meetings, is then once we're to a point where we can have more of a unified consensus voice of the committee, is then to be able to have those discussions then with the community as a whole, and making sure we have that dialogue with everybody within your citizens.
Good. I like that plan. Yeah. So, in your past experience, when you involve the community as a whole with the steering committee, is there some sort of protocol, some sort of preferred practice, or something that, in your professional opinion, works to communicate with as many people as we possibly can?
What we have found to be the most successful is when I'm not talking. It's when the members of your community are the ones that are beginning to say what seems to make sense. Yes, I can offer insight as a consultant to be able to help that dialogue, but the idea is the diverse group that people that sit around the table as much as possible has a unified voice going forward, that after all the things that we've looked at, all the discussions we've had, this seems to make the most sense from the city going forward, and having them then tell their stories of why that seems to make sense. Because they're the ones that have to be here with everybody and have that dialogue. I can help backfill in that, but where we see it most successful is when that steering committee is one of the people that are out in front having that dialogue.
Okay. Okay. Any further questions?
No.
Good stuff.
Very, very good.
Thank you.
Very
I must
concise.
say,
Your memo was very good.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed the opportunity of talking with the committee. We've actually had some spirited discussions, but they've all been positive, and I think everybody is really working towards the best interest of what they believe this community needs. So I think you should be happy with the people you've appointed, and it seems to have worked well to this point. So thank you.
Is it possible to get this in PDF?
Yes, I will send this to Kelly in PDF.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you.
And thanks to the committee for all their efforts. I know they've got a lot of time. Your next meeting is going to be when, Andy?
We have not set a date yet because we're trying to coordinate with some outside counsel to bring that in. So we're hoping within the first or second week of May to have that. I need to do a little bit of work and then get back with city departments to kind of show them where we are, to make sure we've got some consensus there, and then be able to meet them with the committee.
Do you care if I just save this and then?
No,
I can
go right
PDF
ahead.
it?
Okay. All right. Well, that
Thanks
was a
again,
good
Andy.
report, good synopsis. We appreciate that. Okay, so we're ready now. Find my agenda to talk about the preliminary draft of the water and sewer utility rate study that was prepared by H.W. Lochner. All right. How's the best way to set this up, you think? Do we need to? You want to maybe come up and sit on this side of? Okay.
Would you rather stand at the microphone?
Would you rather stand to mic?
It doesn't matter.
You just need to.
And I forgot my flashlight. David's gonna go get it. It has a study on it. So
Okay.
I'll have it shortly. Sorry about that.
That way we can have a discussion, and we have to speak loud so our viewers at home will be able to see or speak directly into the mic.
I
Okay?
apologize. I started getting a sore throat last night. So
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure how to start this, so we'll just ask. Dave, you want to start, or okay? Why don't we let you start, and then we can. I actually got a copy of the study here, so.
Or is he going to explain the principles, or
Yeah, that's-
how he directed and prepared, and then maybe
That's my first
you
question.
interpret?
But you asked it.
Well, it'd be nice to know the methodology.
Sure.
Because I've looked at those charts and looked at them and looked at them, and
and
I think I understand them a little better than I did, but
Sure.
they're pretty detailed.
Would you mind start with an introduction?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
apologize. My name's Chad Lawson.
Chad
I'm with-
Lawson.
Yeah, Lochner.
Thank you.
Out of Salina. I don't know how much of an introduction.
That'll work.
That'll work, okay. So we met with city staff and we received, requested and received information regarding the water usage numbers over like an 18-month period, as well as user numbers, revenue, and capital improvement, forecasted capital improvement, as well as past and projected expenses, budgeted expenses. We took that information, and as far as the methodology in the evaluation, we I feel like that's kind of echoing. We divided the number of users by an average water use and that's located in the appendices, Appendix A, but we divided the users into a use class just by 1,000 gallons each, and then calculated what the percentage of those number of customers are compared to the total number of customers, and also looked at the usage, the average use of those customers based on the total usage. So using those percentages for each one of those, we determined what a, quote, target revenue would be for each one of those classes. And that is what then we use to look at an equitable distribution of rates based on that target revenue percentage. If that makes sense.
Not yet. I'm already a
Okay.
little bit lost.
See,
So-
the term equity is what throws me, and
Okay.
I mean,
Well, I'm a little confused. Why do I care what percentage of the customers use 6,000 to 7,000 gallons a month? Why is that significant to me?
Well, we were just looking at how much of those how much each customer uses to get an idea as to versus we'll look at how much revenue they pay versus how much they use, just as a way
Okay.
to compare how much each class uses versus the total usage.
Okay.
so then the equity part of it is that to make it equitable for the amount of usage so that the revenue goals are obtained? Is that-
It was to look at the distribution of how much each class is paying versus how much I would say they should pay based on their usage, or if that.
Well, your target revenue, is that what you're saying you have to hit to make the account balance at each group has to be at the target revenue to meet your projected?
Well, it's just it was a method to look at to develop the target. Developing the target revenue number was then just a means to look at the actual revenue generated for each of those usage classes to see if the amount of revenue that's being generated by each one of those compares to how much each class is using.
Let me see if I understand it or ask you this question. You know that cities and often use water and sewer rates. They have policy factors that they consider. And for instance, if they're more concerned about economic development, they might treat industries and commercial businesses differently than they treat residents.
Right.
And so if they were more concerned about if it was a community with a large population with fixed incomes, they might want to keep rates low in order to support, those. And this city here has a hardship rate, and in terms of sewer has a little different way they treat commercial and industrial. The way I'm reading this, and I'm asking, I'm not telling you, I'm asking, would it be fair to say that what your equity does is basically flatten everything so that everybody, to determine that everybody is paying essentially the same amount of money for the water they use per gallon?
Yes.
Is that a fair way to put it?
Yes.
Without any policy overlay about favoring one class over another?
Right. Correct.
I think that's the way I'm reading it. I don't know if that helps, but
But this chart is a pretty steep bell curve. You've got two lines there that make up 70% of our customers. 3,000 to 5,000 gallons a month. That's an overwhelming majority of the population right there. So a lot of the rest of them are essentially outliers. There's so few people using the huge numbers or the small numbers. So I guess I'm not sure how this is valuable information to me. I hate to be quite so blunt, but I'm still not following how this is useful.
I'm not sure how to answer, I guess.
Okay. All right.
I
Well, I'm always the slow class, so I probably it'll register on my brain here in a bit.
I apologize. It's just a method that I've used to evaluate some rates before, but
Okay, fair enough.
Because you're looking at the overall picture for the revenue part of it, is that? Because I'm like Gary, I'm kind of having a hard, not kind
Well-
of, I'm having a hard time understanding how all this correlates.
well, it's a means to evaluate the rates on an equal basis for everybody, without trying to, or I shouldn't say without trying to, but just looking at usage, number of users, and then the revenue generated by each.
I still don't even understand that. If you wanted to be, charge everybody an equal amount, you'd charge everybody the same amount per gallon. I mean, for each gallon they buy, it's, so many cents or whatever. So how does this make it more equal?
Well,
I understand what this gentleman said about favoring certain, a hardship rate and economic development, giving Cessna, let's say, for example, a better rate, a favorable rate. But the rest of it, I still don't really understand why it's significant whether you use 3,000 or 5,000 gallons a month.
let me ask another question then. In Table 3A and B, you're basically looking at the current rate structure and just looking at how the money is distributed among these different classes of users, right? Is that fair?
yes.
So then later on, you talk about the 4 different ways that cities set rates: flat rate,
Yeah,
increasing
various
loss
rate
structure.
structures.
Yeah, and from there, you then set out some various options for the commission to consider. And those tables are back in the back, and that's where the policy questions come into play. Is that fair?
Yes.
I mean, you've said in several instances in your report that, for instance, if you were to charge, I mean, just the initial the initial evaluation would raise some rates 4 or 5 times the current
Right. If
monthly
you were
payment.
if you were to take just the fixed costs and divide those equally, that everybody would pay their fair share of the fixed costs, and then look at the variable costs and divide those based on the usage, those rates would end up being 4 or 5 times, I believe, for some of those customers.
for some of those customers. And so from there, you took your spreadsheet and made some adjustments, and I think you went through an iterative process and
Right.
looked at various options, and you provided some of those results in spreadsheets in the report.
Right.
And those are basically your recommendations. My concern with that is that that's a policy. You, as an engineer providing a report, are making recommendations, that's your job, and I'm not. But these guys are the ones that have to make the policy decisions. And so, my thought would be if you could give them the spreadsheet and with the variables, and they can put in the numbers and see what the differences are, then they can figure out from there. They need to make some decisions. Right now you've got a decreasing block structure in the water rates. Do they want to change that to an increasing block structure? Do they want to change it to some other methodology? There's some policy decisions they need to make, big picture, and lays those out. Is that a fair way to characterize that?
Yes.
And would that spreadsheet be available in
Oh, yes.
native format so that they can say, well, we want a base rate of this and we want
Right.
the numbers to
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful. Whether I think we need to talk a little bit about how you got to equity. Your word equity. Took me a little bit to figure out exactly how that worked, but I think I figured it out. So as I understand it, what you did is you took the number of the total number of customers inside and outside the city, and you divided that into by class of users, and said, okay, for instance, people who inside the city who use an average of 500 gallons, they're 0.5% of the total number of customers, right?
Right.
And then you took the percent, then you figured out how much water they used on average, and took the percent of the water they use. So 0.5%, the people who use 500 gallons a month, there are 0.5% of those, but they only use a small fraction of the water, that 0.04%,
Right.
because there are people who use a lot more.
Right.
But then you took an average of those two values. And I didn't understand. I'm not saying they say lawyers should never ask a question they don't know the answer to, but this is one where I'm breaking the rule. Can you explain, why that's equitable?
I looked at it, the easiest way, I guess, to explain it is if I look at, let me make sure I call them out right. So if we're looking at like the percentage of the number of customers in that class, and let's say that's 1% of the total
You're
number
looking
of
at
customers.
3B?
What's that?
You're looking at
I'm looking at
3A or
worksheet 2 back in the appendices.
Let me just ask this. They don't have the, you made some clarifying comments in a very recent iteration. I think they have the last version. And I don't recall.
Okay.
Is that in I looked at the last version, getting ready to this, and, yeah, okay, it's there. Never mind.
It should be.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay.
They're not all, I don't have the version that you have, but
It's in Appendix
it's Appendix
A.
A, which would be after page 44.
Is it the one that we received?
Today.
Preliminary draft.
Worksheet 2, actually, it would, I think he's looking at page 49 of 67. But you don't have 49 of 67. Are you looking at worksheet 2 or
Worksheet 2.
Okay, so it'd be 50, page 50.
Page
Page 50.
50.
Yeah.
Okay.
I added this, preliminary subject to review and some pages on there so that
Okay.
it was a little easier to.
So the second grade column, if the percentage of the number of customers, if that's, say, let's just say 1% of the total number of customers for that user class, and then also looking at the percentage of the total water used. And again, if that user class uses 1% of the total water used, by taking the average, that target revenue would mean that they would be responsible for 1% of the total revenue.
Under the existing
Right.
rate structure.
Right, yes. Yes, this was to look at, or just compare the existing rate structure.
I think it might be 49. Well, no.
50 says general customer profile
Yeah,
sewer.
I'm sorry, it's page 48. I'm. There you go. I think that's it. I mean, this target revenue in the last column on the page 48 of 67 is how you got to
Correct, the target revenue.
the
that's
target
in-
revenue
in
that's back
3B.
in 3A and B.
Correct.
And it's the average, and I'm just looking at the top row on worksheet 2 at the top of that page. So for customers under 1,000 gallons, average use, there are 23 customers. They are 0.52% of the total number of customers, including in-city and outside.
Correct.
They use an average of 500 gallons a month, and 22.33 times 500 is the 11,167. This is the 0.04 is the percent they use, and then you took the 0.52 customer percentage of total and percent of average total used, the 0.52
And,
plus 0.04 divided by 2 to come up with 0.28.
right,
I mean, that's how you got there.
correct.
Okay. You've used that before? That's a standard way of using it?
Well, it's one that I've used before. I'm not sure that the math is similar to what, somebody like Ransom Financial or somebody would use, but it's a method used to evaluate rates.
Sure. And there are probably other methods that
Yes,
you could
I
use.
assume so,
But this
yes.
is the one you chose, and it's the one you've used and is, okay.
So then on that far right column where it says target revenue, all those numbers then would add up to 100%? Or would it be some factor less than that? Because you said the target revenue was fixed cost, all that stuff that's in there.
I'm not sure if they add up to 100% or not.
I don't think they do, that's why I was asking. So then how do you know what the variance is that you get to the revenue, the target revenue number? I'm pretty simplistic when it comes to the math. If it doesn't add up to 100%, why not? Where's the difference?
I think it does add up to 100%.
Does it?
Oh, well, wait a minute, let me make sure. My totals are 80.24 for in-city and 19.76 for outside of the city. And I think that's 100.
Oh, I see. So you add both of them up.
Yeah, you need, it's
okay.
both
I see.
inside and outside customers.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay.
So those
Because the
total,
top one doesn't, I know.
Right.
Okay, because I'm playing with the math there.
That's,
so those percentages are also based on the, total number of customers for both tables, inside and outside.
So it includes inside and outside
Yes.
customers to get the 100%.
Correct.
None of that makes sense. Okay.
well, that's my question. Does that make sense? I mean.
Well, I understand what these are telling us.
Right, right. It makes sense to how they got there, I understand.
Yeah.
I guess in the calculation and in the calculation of revenue, and this is back on table 3A and B, you calculate the percent of revenue. You say, you take the number of customers times the rate they're paying to say that each class pays a total amount of revenue in each class, and then you say, well, what's that percentage? And so you're taking what they're actually paying now, the percent they're paying now, versus the target to determine whether or not that class is
Paying their fair share.
okay, and fair share is a value judgment that you're making, and that's where I'm getting a little heartburn.
Okay.
I mean, when you say equity and fair share, that's really a value judgment, and I'm not being critical. I'm just saying that that's really for them to make, as opposed for me to make or you to make, because we don't get to make policy. We make recommendations and suggestions.
I understand.
Or is that, do you have to look at the different categories to determine how you're going to get to the total amount of water sold, or?
When it comes to the actual rate structure.
With a declining,
Yeah, versus the increasing or the standard block structure.
does this,
This was just to look at where the customers are now in the existing rate structure. When we were looking at those various proposed structures, we did compare it to this just to see, does it fall into something similar as to what the customers are under now? Is that?
and so when you have a single block rate, everybody pays the same rate for every gallon of water that they purchase, then the spread of use, does that become less critical? When you have a declining rate, then does that make it harder to balance out because you're trying to project what each category is going to consume to determine what percentage that is, to be what percentage of your $100 is going to be?
Well, the single block structure was, it still has a flow rate component to it based on their usage, but it's just it's a single rate, not a declining or inclining rate. So if your first 5,000 gallons is a set rate, the next 10,000 gallons is a set rate. It's your each 1,000 gallons is one rate. So it's still, as the usage goes up, it's still based on your usage. It's just everybody pays that same rate per 1,000 gallons.
So the revenue on the single block rate would stay constant across the use, whether they're using 1,000 gallons or using 5,000 gallons or 6 or 10,000 gallons.
Well, your total revenue would, depending on the total amount of water consumed, it would stay, total revenue would stay roughly the same consistently. And then you have the base rate for each of the customers.
Okay.
And the single block rate is shown in the various options you discussed or in the table 4A series, correct?
Yes.
And so you've just basically said, okay, here's a minimum charge plus this rate, and shown what each customer class would have.
Right.
And then you have in the 5 series of tables, you show how a decreasing block structure would work, which is what you've got now. And then in the next series, it's the increasing block structure, correct?
Correct.
Talk a little bit about fixed costs versus variable costs and how that factors into this. I think it's an important concept for the council to understand.
So the fixed costs, I think the easiest place to look at it is I gotta find it. Table 13. I'm sorry, I don't have pages. It's page numbers. Should be around page 39.
And your table 13, those are it's based on existing rate structure, correct? Or not?
The 2016 numbers that are shown.
Okay. Let me ask a kind of a backup question here. We're talking about water rates. The methodology that you used for the water rates is used substantially the same. There's some differences, but you use the same methodology for the sewer rates as well, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I mean, it's almost everything we're saying about water rates applies
To the sewer.
To the sewer. And we probably, are there distinctions, or maybe that's a question for later, but let's stick with water for now. But I want to just come back to making sure that we understand what, if any, distinctions are made on sewer rates.
So in table 13, the top portion is the revenue and the various revenue pieces that were shown in the budget. Below that is fixed cost expenses, and then there's variable cost expenses. So the fixed costs include existing debt service for each utility, as well as your known expenses, your labor for salaried employees, the things like insurance, legal fees, those kind of things, whereas variable expenses are expenses that could change based on the amount of, in this case, water that would need to be produced. So chemicals at the treatment plant, electricity, overtime rates for employees that may need it. The starting point, I guess, or the first thing we looked at is if you take the fixed costs and for the expenses, and those are going to be the same for the year, what would a base rate need to be to cover those expenses? Because you're going to have to pay those if usage goes down, and it's not, you're still able to pay those fixed rates versus the variables. So that's where Mr. Tracer was talking about how when we looked at that initial rate, it was going to be 4 or 5 times higher than what some of the customers are paying now, because if we take those fixed expenses and divide it over the number of users, that rate was substantially higher than the current base rate is now.
So you're not recommending it, you're just showing us what the effect would be.
What it would be, right, to some of the customers. I mean, again, keep that in mind. So
really we got 2 components of our rate, and maybe that's where some confusion can come, that if we've got fixed costs, then the base rate that we charge, we need to determine what our fixed costs are and get all those covered in the base monthly rate, where water production then and usage, that rate is based upon the variable factors. And that's where it determines on how much water is used and distributed. It's affected by our repairs each year.
You're talking total amount of water, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So when we look at our rate adjustment, we should be evaluating both the base, not just do it across the board percentage, but we should look at our base cost for monthly charge and adjust it separate than the variable rate.
But just an observation, I think that your current ordinance, you just water, you just charge a flat rate, and but for sewer rates, you do have a monthly minimum. There's no monthly minimum for water that I see at least in the rate ordinance part.
in the existing water rate structure, correct.
So
We were given some direction by staff that to look at least trying to cover some of the fixed costs. If water consumption goes down, then you're not in as much trouble, with revenue trying to cover expenses. I don't know if that was something that was just experienced, but we were asked to look at what could we do for a base rate to at least help cover some of those fixed costs. But like I said, when we looked at that, what that number would be, $40 some dollars, I think it was. It was just pushing those customer bills higher than we, I guess, would recommend for some of those users being 4 and 5
knowing
times
that
higher.
would be politically unpalatable.
Yeah.
But then in the base
I
rate,
mean, maybe, I guess. I mean, I don't know about Independence, but
And
I do know how it is in other cities.
And some of the driving factors on, or I'm going to say a large driving factor on those fixed expenses is the proposed capital outlay projects or capital improvement projects that are coming up. And we were just looking at bonding those projects not, as the presenter before me was talking about, taking advantage of either grants or low-interest loans or whatever for those kind of projects. These would obviously fall into that category, not knowing whether or not you qualify for those or whatever the case may be. But that could reduce some of that fixed expenses in each of those years.
But if you had the fixed costs are the most simplest to look at finding efficiencies to reduce that cost, to reevaluate process, manpower, equipment, modifications that could change utility use. That's easier to have some better control on that expense. And then if you did have at least some base rate charge, not the $40, but you could look at a guaranteed funding instead of just trying to absorb all of it into one rate structure. I thought we did have a set meter charge if you have a water meter, a base charge monthly on it. I guess that just shows I just look at how much is owed and send
charge
it.
for the first 1,000 gallons than there is.
Yeah.
Well, there's a basic charge if you don't use any water too, which is not much.
First 1,000.
Yeah, you're going to get charged that first 1,000 rate.
Yeah, I think that first 1,000 is, quote, a minimum charge. Whether you use 5 gallons or a 99, or, whatever, it's you're still getting charged that $7.18.
After that, it's prorated. Is that fair?
It's tiered. And then
Well,
I'd say
but
Is
if
that
I
first
use-
one prorated to over that
Prorated.
1,000 gallons? Is what you're
No.
If
asking?
I
so-
use 1,100 gallons one month and 1,900 gallons the next month, my bill is going to be slightly different each month.
yes, it would, because then after you hit that 1,000 gallons, if you used 100 gallons or you used 999, that first rate is
Right.
going to get you the same. Once you jump over that and get 1 gallon over, then you go into that next tier.
Right.
And as I recall, I think that runs up to
It's $3.33, and so, I mean, some cities say, and when you read the ordinance the way it's drafted, it's kind of so the next 9,000 gallons or any part thereof.
yes.
If you stop there, it's like, okay, you go over that threshold, now you pay the full amount, but then it's per 1,000 gallons, and so, it's
For
the way it's
set
drafted.
up,
It's
Yeah, the way it's set up, there's not a lot of incentive in between 1,000 and 9,000 gallons to conserve or watch your usage or anything of that nature. Where that's going to get you is going to be on the sewer side.
Yeah,
But otherwise, yeah, you're pretty flat in there.
right. And that's another interesting question. And when you did some of your analysis, you had a break at I don't know, 10,000 gallons. But there is, as the Commissioner pointed out, this huge block of users at 6 or I can't remember 5 to 7,000. So I was looking at it and thinking, well, I wonder why we don't put the break,
Closer to there.
Closer to there, and that's again a value judgment to be made
True.
at further in.
Can I ask a question on this? So in the evaluation, we talked about fixed cost and we talked about variable cost, but in that you have debt service included in the fixed cost, which it is a fixed cost once that debt service is established. Once you've committed to that project, you have a lifespan on that. But would it not make more sense to break out that debt service and have true fixed cost? What's it going to take to operate the facility? Then also look at your variable costs. It's going to be a function of the consumption, how much water we have to create, and then have the debt service as a piece so you could break that down and know exactly, piece by piece, what we're spending what's going to have to be generated as a result and how that rate's going to be impacted by it.
And then just use, or see what the base rate would be to establish based on
Just the fixed
that.
cost,
Now,
as it exists today.
And as far as the debt service, I assume then do the same for the capital improvements.
Exactly.
And keep those all in the same
Yes.
thing.
I guess I'm not following exactly what you're
Okay,
saying.
so
I think I understand.
It would change
Okay.
it would change the adjustable rate.
Exactly. Because today it's going to cost X dollars to operate, period. But if we do nothing at all, I mean, there's so much for just maintaining the buildings, electric, whatnot, the basic day-to-day stuff, staffing it. That should be the fixed piece of things. And what I'm suggesting is we break out any of the debt service or any of the projects, whether depends on what level you're looking at. You know, you might have 5 different options of how much debt we want to go into, but keep that fixed cost so that we can establish what that base rate is, so that we know, like he said earlier, we know that that's covered regardless of what the usage is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. I mean, what you're saying is take the debt service and move it over into variable as opposed to.
I'd even, yes, to a sense, yeah. So that variable charge would be covering the debt piece of it, so that we know what the base is. This is the bare minimum we have to have just to cover things the way we are today. Yes.
Well, let me just tell you that you have a combined utility. Under the statute, you have a combined utility that says, okay, we're putting water and sewer into the same entity. And the statute says that you have to charge a reasonable rate. And so I read the statute where there's a difference of opinion with some in the room about what that means. But I read the statute to say that's a minimum charge that you have to impose in your rate ordinance to collect enough revenue to cover these 3 categories of costs that we've sort of talked about: fixed costs, debt service, and variable costs. And so there's a statutory obligation that the city has to charge a rate that is high enough to cover all those costs, however you divide it up. And so, I mean, that's the law. That's an obligation that you have, regardless.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that.
Well, I mean, it's not just smart business,
Yes.
good government, but you're required in the statute.
No, and because it is an enterprise fund, I mean, you're not supposed to be. But I think we're on the same page in one sense. Maybe I just said it a little differently. But, yeah, and we get ourselves in a situation, and I think we're a little bit there now, even as far as some of the funding sources. When we look at some of those funding sources, if we're not charging a high enough level based on a certain percentage of like communities, that we can be ineligible for some of that funding.
Like that low interest rate
Correct.
grant or loan that we were.
There
That's
are
what Terry
certain-
brought up to
yeah.
us last night.
There are certain funding entities that require you to be at a minimum rate, whatever that is set at, in order to be eligible for those funding.
Why would you want to operate a enterprise
Yeah.
or a business with the intention of not generating enough revenue to operate it?
Doesn't make sense.
You know, that's the whole point. We haven't known exactly where that is, and it's always harder to catch up. And
Well, you'd have to come up with the revenue from some other source, and then, that's a problem. I mean, it's not only a problem; it's violates the law. So,
Statute.
I
just
guess
so you know.
I didn't think that's what you were saying, though. You were just,
Well-
trying to, instead of putting those capital improvements and debt service into the fixed cost, which would then translate into like the base rate, But it would treat it more as a variable cost, and which would then go into the usage rate.
Yes, to a
Within-
degree, yes.
Within the rate structure itself.
Yes. Just from a valuation standpoint.
And I mean, I can give you an idea of what that would be by, looking at it. But in essence, I feel like we've done that because that initial, if we took that all those fixed expenses and divided it out over the number of customers, that base rate would be $40-some. And I've trimmed that back to lessen the cost, or to spread the revenue, try to spread it over the users and stuff. So I have trimmed that back. I don't know where that would fall in your scenario, but we could look at it and see. Because instead of paying $2.95 per 1,000 gallons for on that usage rate, under the scenario of applying all the fixed expenses to the users, at a $44 rate or whatever that was, that usage rate might have was like $1 or something. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So we could look at it and give you an idea what that would mean if we were to take those capital improvements and outlay our debt service out, and run that number just to see how it would compare. If that's
In the end, whatever we do, we've got to get the same amount of money generated.
right. The intent in the report was to cover those expenses.
If you leave the fixed rate with the debt service there, or increase that amount slightly, say all the improvements, that what you're doing instead of calling it debt service would be a portion, a line item to handle all repairs, so that when that debt is retired, you still gather the money so that you could go with another debt. You got to generate enough money in the future, whether you go right into another program that requires a large sum of money. But if you retire that obligation, and then next year you still generate that revenue and leave it in there, and the next year, then you've got something to draw from.
The reserve account.
Yeah,
Right.
I think you're going right down the path that I was, and that's why I'm trying to isolate that, because those capital projects, they're not forever. There is a finality to those. At some point in time, that debt's going to be paid off. But then you have to start thinking about the future. What happens the next time this comes around? How are we going to maintain it? Because every year you get a little older, it's going to.
So in that 20-year period, then you start the cycle over.
Yes.
But we have to get there first.
Right, and then so I think it's better to
have to get
isolate
there.
that piece of it so we understand that of it. I mean, the electricity, we know that's going to be there every day. It's going to be there tomorrow, and it's going to be there 50 years from now. That debt service is not necessarily going to be there. Maybe it is in some years, and some years it is not. So I think isolating that makes more sense, so we can truly understand what impact that is and how that's the piece that's got to be managed.
Yeah, because if we've got a debt service of $5 a month, really we need to charge $6 so that at the end of that debt, we'll have money to. Sometimes you can draw it out so far that by the time you pay off the motor, it's time to replace the motor again, and all you end up doing is chasing your tail. That it'd be nice to have a reserve that the first time we might be able to generate enough revenue to pay half of a new motor. The second time we've generated enough revenue to pay 3/4 of a motor. The next time we have the money in reserve to buy a motor. And then we can put all of our interest back into that fund so that we can continue.
We actually we almost did that last night with the dumpster program. Much smaller scale. We actually did that same thing last night.
So
That's
you
why-
want to set like a separate, or treat that totally separate, even from the usage, but like a debt service retirement fee.
Correct.
I mean, so
Yeah, so I mean, there's a
That's
fund
a fair,
there.
That's a fair.
I mean
term.
that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a fair.
I mean that's I've seen that before. I mean, as far as I think that's
I mean, at least
something
work
what they've
towards it.
called
Look at it and
a
see
debt
what it
service
looks like, 'cause
retirement, or
you gotta be
something
cognizant of-
that could be retired once the debt service is gone, or I suppose continued if it.
Debt service / reserve, because at some point in time, the goal will be to turn that into a reserve fund.
That you build up, and then the next time you're going
Then-
around, maybe you minimize how much you have to borrow the next time, or maybe not at all.
Which is a
You
better deal for
self-fund
taxpayers,
yourself, yeah.
ratepayers. Yeah.
And looking at our minimum charge for 1,000 gallons, if that, that's across the board, everybody's paying it.
It's like a per meter charge.
Yeah, so if you raise that $1, you're generating a lot more revenue than putting a large rate change on the higher gallon usage. And like it was mentioned, bringing down to the break from 9,000 maybe to 5. So, there's ways to adjust to bring redistribution of the revenue that's not going to affect everybody drastically, but it just can generate more money.
So to get to that point, though, you
Yeah.
got to know your expenses and repairs. Like I was noticing here on repairs,
Yeah.
on that page 41. If you look on line 41 and 42, that I don't know. That's $4,500 for water.
Yeah.
That doesn't repair anything, does it?
No.
No, not really.
So
The water valve.
That was a budgeted number. That,
Yeah.
it was a budgeted number.
Yeah. Within,
Seems like it was just pulled out of the air.
well, I don't know where it came from.
You didn't.
I did not.
That revenue. I mean, there was some discussion here about. I mean, you said something about saving money on those fixed costs. That wasn't part of your charge, right?
No.
okay.
This was just these were budgeted expenses. So I presumed you guys had used that for things or whatever the case may be. But most of your most of your maintenance on the water and sewer, my guess, falls in the items 39 and 40.
I was going to say it's somewhere else in here. Where's it at?
What does the O&M stand for?
Operation and maintenance. So
So
your
it's probably
chemical
in there.
costs, your electrical costs, as well as repairs. I mean, could be. I mean,
So the expenses,
physically
I guess my
maintaining-
question is the expenses are in the totals.
Correct.
It just may not be in the right bucket, for lack of the
Not where you
right.
expected to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, these were just as they were budgeted.
Yeah, that water repairs has got to be something we don't understand.
Yeah.
To be that low.
There'd be a possibility that we could get these spreadsheets so that, staff could maybe
Yeah.
take a look at
I'm,
them.
not, I'm not nitpicking. I'm just curious if this really is a fair reflection, looking at that number. If those repair expenses are in here somewhere else, that we can accept that. But just looking at it on a piece of paper doesn't tell me that.
Yeah, I don't know why they were separated. The actual, the O&M expenses within the budget were different than the repair.
Can I address the repairs?
Sure.
We had one time, until a couple of years ago, had $100,000 a year in the water plant budget to do repairs of equipment, and that got cut.
Wow.
That got cut.
That got cut because
4,500?
So
Trying-
you just
trying to
weren't going to
make-
fix anything.
trying to make a budget
I'm
balance.
being
we're-
facetious.
We're doing what we have to do but it was there, and we generally spent about $100,000 a year doing repairs on equipment in that plant every year.
Well, repairs, Terry, haven't just mysteriously gone away. So they're in here somewhere.
I
you've
mean,
had-
we massage it, we work it, and we try and make it all fit. But it's a very hard task at sometimes making it all fit in that bucket. And the bottom line is, like David said, it is a combined utility, and a lot of times wastewater is supplementing water right now. That's the bottom line. And that means that sewer work is not getting done because we're supplementing the water treatment plant to keep it in operation.
And I think that's what we've been talking, I know, for the last 2 to 3 years, that we have to change that.
Yeah.
That we can't keep robbing Peter to pay Paul and then sit around and wonder why hasn't something been done. I mean, look at City Hall, for example.
Yeah.
We did that there, and we got money coming in. There's ways of generating money to do the repairs. We've got to keep it going forward, that we have to do the repairs before it's an emergency. And it is hard to see, like Fred's saying, to understand the O&M. Is that your repairs? We're assuming it's all there. When I see water repair, I think that's water line and
That's what I.
and valve replacement. And if you're with
No, we have
$4,500,
separate.
all you can do is chase a leak. Our lines, we have to be more aggressive with our line repair. That you go out there so old, you fix one patch, you dig up one,
Right.
but you keep going back 10 or 15 feet each way to find good pipe to tie on. So $4,500 doesn't get us.
Well, there's a lot
Anyway.
more money in the budget for line repair and line work than $4,500.
Okay.
You're looking,
Okay.
it's in there.
It's in there somewhere.
Well, just mainline repairs, we have a budget is $70,000 a year, and then we also have, I believe, $75,000 budget this year for line replacement. So we have money in there for that.
I think it would be good for it, because I think a lot of this was done prior to my time getting here, which almost had to been. But you could use that. No, at that point in time when you can't use that. So I think maybe it would be a good idea that Terry and I spend a little time with Chad and understand exactly what got into some of these cost numbers. So that we got a true reflection of what's really going on.
They probably got a budget where they cut everything down, and then, he didn't realize
Well,
that.
and that's all well and good, but that doesn't take away from the expense. If there's a repair, if there's something that breaks, we got to fix it.
Yeah,
And so then the question is, because a budget's a dream, cash becomes reality.
Yes.
We have to fix it.
Right.
Because people got to have water.
And I think
So-
that goes to my point, though. I mean, if you ask me, hey, Mike, is this number right? I don't know. I can't speak to that number. I don't know what's in that number.
But just to make this point, now we're talking about the budget, and that was a given for Chad.
Yeah.
And that's okay to have the discussion.
Yes,
but we're not.
yeah.
We're off of rates. We're on to expenses, which
we're
is
in a different area.
So we need to get back on rates.
well. This is your meeting. You can do what you want. And I'm not. I just want to point out
No,
that
but-
we are discussing budget, not rates, and that's fine.
Yeah, but
it
part of the rate
matters.
is based on $4,500 a year for repairs.
Matters.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
it doesn't it all tie together
It
from the
does.
aspect
I'm not arguing that point. I'm just. It's a
because
merely
the total
making-
expenses is what's going to affect the rate.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay.
And that.
So from that point, then we can move forward to talk about rates. So if the $4,054,084, thank you, Terry. If the $4,054,084, I get it out. If that's expenses, then we have to cover that rate-wise and more, which I think in 2016, we didn't cover it. By 508,000.
Yeah, based on the information that we have yet.
Yes. Here's, I guess, where I'm headed with it is this. As I understand it, the contract that you have with the city is to do this rates rate analysis, provide a report, which you've done, have some consultation, and then prepare, based on that consultation, a final report. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so this is your first draft, okay? We're talking now about making some, it might be good for the city to look at the budget, to make sure that it's, to give him a new set of numbers to start with, because that's where you need to start. And so if there's some discussion that needs to happen internally about where the money is and where it's going, I think that that's probably the next step that needs to be taken so that we can provide it to Chad so he can redo this, or in his final report, use numbers that you guys are comfortable with, and that you guys have. So that's my just suggestion about how we move forward from here. My second suggestion for how we move forward from here is, we've talked a little bit about your calculation of the target value and how you got there, and that you've used that in the past. We've talked about the idea that equity is a matter for the commission. You also, in your report, both in the sewer and the water side, talk about the variance plus or minus 2%, as opposed, is it equitable? And that, to me, again, is another value judgment. And so I would suggest, respectfully, that when you're going back through this report, that you try to think about what's your value judgment versus an engineering recommendation for what, and take, I guess that's my major concern with this report is that you make value judgments, which are, I don't think you can take them all out. I'm not suggesting you can, but I think it's, I think you want to make sure that they make the value judgments rather than me making them, telling you what they ought to be, or you making them. That would be my concern. Is plus or minus 2% the right number? Well, might be or might not. I do think it's helpful to at least have this. Okay, here's the flat. I think that's interesting and helpful, but where you go from there is another matter. That's I said we needed to come back to the difference between water and sewer, and if we can go there if you want to, or my question about water and sewer, you have tables in each one of your 3 to 6 or 7, whatever, for inside the city, outside the city. But you don't have that on the sewer side. You just have a single table that evaluates everything. And that's table 10 in the report. I did the math. I figured out that you actually, for the sewer district, you actually used when you figured the revenue, you used their rate versus, and everybody else you used the in-town rate. And so at first I thought, I was kind of confused about that, but I see that you used their rate. Is that the only any outside the city limit adjustments you made? Because I didn't look at every column.
Yeah, that was the only one that we were told was outside the city.
That's fine.
All the others
I just
we were told were-
I'm asking a question I already know the answer to. I just am asking you for clarification.
Sure.
That's the. What other differences, if any, are there between the analysis for the water rate versus the sewer rate, conceptually? If you know, or if you.
The process was the same for both. So, with the target revenue and everything, the difference being that the sewer structure or the sewer rates right now, as was mentioned, are more or less subsidizing the water. So there wasn't a lot of adjustment needed in that. So I didn't consider overhauling the rate structure. It was just a matter of a little bit of adjustment, and kept the structure the same.
So as far as you know, I mean, it is a combined utility, and so when we say sewer supplements water, or if it were the other way, that's perfectly acceptable, isn't it?
Correct.
From a legal standpoint. I mean,
Yeah,
policy
I
may be
hesitate
different,
to-
but.
Right. I hesitate to use that subsidizing, I mean, because it's combined.
Right.
But,
Okay.
So in the final presentation, are you going to present the three options, the solid block, the decreasing, and the increasing, or will this just be to one direction? Or is that something the commission, we should decide which way to go, or reevaluate all three?
I think we're scheduled for an executive session. I have some other comments and thoughts that I'd like to share with the commission, but I hesitate to do that in public. It's attorney-client communications that are privileged, and I'd like to not reserve my comments on that question.
So then for final direction for Chad, we'll get back.
I think that would be an appropriate approach.
Okay.
It wouldn't hurt to provide all three tables, and then you guys can
So
look at
just
it.
to look at it so that, revenue.
So you know what the different options, what they're gonna look like on the rates.
Well,
With that information,
Well, we can just
I
go over that.
agree. I mean,
it's not gonna hurt
No.
to get all
No,
scenarios.
I think that's the right answer.
I mean, yeah,
No.
information's
part of the
powerful. There's
study.
nothing, we don't interfere the information part of it.
Right.
And then you can
The
make
other
your
part we
decision
may
after you
interfere,
have all
but
the
not that.
information.
You need the rate study in its entirety
Right.
to be able to make decisions about how you want to set rates.
Yeah.
I sometimes am hypersensitive to making public statements that, in public, and I'm perfectly comfortable saying, yeah, look at all of the rates and make a decision. You don't want to make decisions about what kind of structure you're going to have until you have all the information.
Okay. So I think we've come to a point now where I think we have some direction, correct?
Yes.
I mean, staff is comfortable, you're comfortable,
I'm comfortable that we can move forward, yes.
and then commissioners, no, you're comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay, Gary, and I'm comfortable with it, so I think all in all, we can say this was a very productive session
Sure helped to.
for understanding it. For me personally, understanding it was big. I mean, know what I was looking at, because those terms don't mean anything to me. You ask me school terms, I can tell you.
Yeah, I learned some things in too, as far as the judgment call and stuff. So
Well, and that's,
I'll
I'm not being
work on
critical.
it, right.
I'm not being critical of what you did. I get exactly where you're going and why you went there. And the other thing about this is, as you made a comment to me before the meeting started, getting this written down in a way that's understandable is very difficult. I mean, I get why.
It's one thing doing numbers, it's
Right.
another thing explaining it in
Right,
writing how it's.
right.
yeah.
So it's.
Okay. Well, I think we're ready then to go into executive session. It is 10:39. Recommendation on length of executive session? 30 minutes?
Yeah.
30 minutes, good?
I-
We can start there, and if we have to
Start there.
extend, we extend.
Yeah.
And who's going to attend that?
See, we will have Kelly, the commissioners, Kelly, Mike, and
Council David Traster
And-
and Jeff Chubb.
Right. Okay. Got that? Okay. So I'd make a motion then that we go into executive session for 30 minutes for attorney-client privilege.
Does Terry Liber?
Yeah, Terry. Yeah, Terry ought to. Good thought. That's why I was looking at you. Who else needs to go in?
He kind of looked like he had hurt his feelings that we left him out.
Would you be hurt, Terry? Terry Liburd will be in too. So it's been moved and it's been seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. We are ready to go into executive session.
So we can let Chad go.
Okay. We are back in open session and we're ready to adjourn. So I would entertain a motion then that we adjourn this special meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And getting ready to go eat lunch. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.